Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Computer Tech and More. Today we were going to take a look at the Thermaltake Ring Quad 12 RGB fan and the Corsair SP120 RGB Elite. However, I found out that the Thermaltake Quad requires a custom connector. This USB 2 connector is reversed and requires Thermaltake's proprietary hub, which I do not have, to run this fan. So already I do not recommend this fan. I do not recommend any proprietary plugs and hubs or anything like that. If it cannot work in a standard fan header or standard USB 2 port on your motherboard, it should not exist. So this fan is out. So this review is going to only be about the Corsair. So let's jump right into those graphs. Okay, first up is the case airflow simulation test. This case airflow test simulates a case that can hold up to a 180 millimeter size fan. First graph up is the case airflow simulation test. This simulates a case that can hold up to a 180 millimeter size fan, so it would be considered a large, well, not large, but mid-tower to large size case. And there are couple different ways of being able to look at this data to use it for your specific purposes. So first is like a scientific explanation. The most perfect fan in the world would have a perfect cylinder of air traveling behind it. This ignores air losses or any other kind of air resistance that happens as air travels away from its source. So in reality, the air is being pushed and slowed down by the air in the case altogether. So it kind of spreads out the air and has a general loss in air velocity. So what we're looking for is as slow a loss as possible, so that would be as shallow a line as possible, and as linear line as possible. This indicates that the fan is slowing down as little as possible and is creating that nice cylinder of air traveling behind it, as opposed to just shooting air off to the sides in all directions. Kind of like what we're seeing with the Corsair IQ. It appears to be shooting air off basically in every direction, whichy way. So it's losing a lot of air velocity just very quickly. Matter of fact, at the 11-inch mark, it's pretty much at 0 airspeed. This brings me to the other way to use this data. So I used 4 data points, 6 inches, 9 inches, 11 inches, and 14.5 inches. And each of those are representative of different size cases. 6 inches is representative of a small form factor case that is still sort of a standard type layout. 9 inches is definitely a compact case, but still assuming a standard airflow design. 11 inches represents a mid-tower, something like the Corsair 550D or Meshify 2C, something like that. And 14.5 is representative of a large case, something like the Fractal Design Torrent. And what you're looking for when selecting case fans is you want the highest airspeed possible. This is assuming you have a air cooler as opposed to an AIO, or a 120 millimeter size radiator on the back of your case would also be applicable to this, but it basically assumes you have an air cooler. You want the highest air speed possible at the size of your case, or the size category of your case. And the reason for this is it basically allows more air to be flushed out of your case at any given point. So if the airspeed is effectively 0, well, then no air is going to get out of your case. So you want the highest possible airspeed for the size of your case. Next is a very simple graph. It has the IQ from Corsair, the SP120, and it's versus my control fan. My control fan is based 3 parts on the A12X25 and 1 part on the A14. Both Noctua fans, both fans I consider to be very good. So fans that perform better than it should be considered truly excellent. Fans that perform around it would be considered good, and fans that are way off should be considered very poor performers in a case airflow type application. And this graph is specifically for noise normalized performance. My noise normalized level is rated off of 40 decibels, which is, by my current testing methodology, with the microphone placed really close to the fan, so it's an exaggerated noise level, off of the A12X25, running at around 1,200 RPM when it was running through my old system in a Corsair 550D through an AIO, 2 fans blowing through it. So that's where that number is based off of. So looking at this, it's pretty clear that the SP120 is very bad. Do things change at 100% PWM? No, they don't. Well, here's the RPM, there's the noise level, 49 decibels. So it's not particularly loud. However, it's not pushing a particularly large amount of air. So let's just move on. How does it compare against a bunch of other fans I've tested? Well, prior to this fan, one of my lowest performers was the NF-S12B, and this is for noise normalized results. I want to make that clear. On the key over here, or the legend, we have the fan name and the RPM listed. So the SP120 is right here, and it's dog poop. It's dog poop. Don't buy it for case airflow applications. The Corsair AF120 ELITE, on the other hand, is actually performing quite well in this yellow line. It's actually off the chart there. Well, how does it compare at 100% PWM? Well, it's still dog poop. It's still at the bottom of the graphs. It's really not worth considering. The AF ELITE is this one, not to be confused with the Tough Fan 12, which is this line. So there are just better fans out there for case airflow applications. Don't buy it for that. I should note right now that SP in Corsair's naming terminology does mean more like static pressure, so this isn't really a surprise, but it's worth testing everything. Okay, we're taking a look at the 9-inch mark. It's a good middle ground between the fans that shoot air off in every direction, do really bad in case airflow, and they haven't completely lost all their airspeed, and ones that do perform really well. And as we kind of saw from the graphs, it still did kind of okay at the 9-inch mark. It hadn't completely dropped away to 0 like it did at 11, so it was a good decision on my part to do that. But yeah, it's not good. So let's just move on. Corsair SP120 RGB ELITE. Alright, this next graph is Thru, my CPU cooler, which is a U12A from Noctua, and the left graph is RPM versus airspeed. The right graph is noise versus airspeed. Both of them are through the cooler. In both these graphs, better fans are going to be sitting in the top left, worse fans are in the bottom right, and airspeed is vertical on both of them. The horizontal on RPM one is RPM, the horizontal on the noise one is noise. So let's just get into taking a look at it. Well, this is where the Corsair looks to be doing a bit better. So first and foremost, the left graph is very much a blade analysis. It's how good is this blade design at a given RPM at pushing air. And it's pretty clear that Corsair knows what they're doing in terms of the blade design. It is outperforming my control fan by a little bit, not a lot. So that means it's got a very good blade design at moving air. But when we take a look at the right graph, it's pretty clear that they sacrificed something. They sacrificed noise performance. It's not terrible, but it's quite a bit off the given track for its noise values. Well, how does it compare against other fans? First up is noise normalized values. A couple key pieces of information about this graph. Over here, this legend is a performance level, so wattage. So 250 watts equals 3 meters per second. So this is the values I calculated and measured using my 11700K with this particular air cooler, the U12A, with one fan attached to it on the front. And I have a whole piece on my whole testing methodology to get there where specific how much wattage cooling one fan could do at a specific level. So each PWM fan signal and what the airspeed coming out of it was to what wattage it actually could sustain the load. So if you have a different CPU than me and the same cooler, those wattages don't quite apply. If you have a different cooler than me and the same CPU, those wattages don't apply. If you have a different cooler and a different CPU, those wattages don't apply. But what does apply is a performance difference at the given noise level. So let's say you have an Arctic P12 and it's doing 0.7 meters per second airflow for this noise level. Well, if you jumped up to the AF120 ELITE, you'd get much more performance for the same noise level. This means you could run it at a higher wattage, or if it's a basically fixed wattage cooler or CPU, you could run it at lower temperatures, or you could back off that fan airspeed, so it would now run quieter for the same noise level. That's how you can use this. And one other note that I want to clarify. So similar to how clock speed is related to wattage, in that as you start reaching the upper limits of a CPU's performance, more and more wattage is required to get smaller and smaller increments of improved clock speed. The same way air cooling it does for how much heat dissipation it can do. So at some point, you're going to be blowing so much air through it where you're not going to be getting that much more extra performance, much more cooling. There's only so much air or heat that air can extract from the fins or the radiators. And this is true on both radiators and for heat sinks, tower coolers. The difference comes with how dense the fin stack is. So the more densely packed the fins are, so radiators are the best example of this, the more tightly packed it is, the more heat can be extracted for any given amount of air traveling through it than something that has a looser fin stack, like a very loosely spaced heat sink on an air cooler. But a very tight fin stack on a heatsink air cooler will be able to extract more heat out of a given airflow than that looser stack one. So everything still applies across the board. It's just how much heat, extra heat, can be achieved, and that's something that is kind of outside my scope at this point because, well, I don't have access to build my own heat sinks to truly do accurate measurements of what fin spacing would give the optimal performance. That's where the cooler manufacturers should be doing the research. So now that I've talked science out your ear, how does the SP120 do? Well, it's pushing 1 meter per second of air, and it's kind of okay. I want to bring up the inaccuracies in my scientific measurements, and my anemometer is accurate to within plus or minus 0.1 meter per second. That means fans that are within 0.1 meters per second of each other could be considered functionally equivalent. However, I run every test 3 times, and I averaged the results. And it was pretty clear to me that this is how fans rank against each other. So even though they could be considered functionally equivalent, they really aren't, but they're very close in performance. So after all that explanation, what do I think of the IQ SP120? Well, it's a little bit underperforming compared to other fans. Taking a look at how it does at 100% PWM fan signaling, and it's still kind of underperforming overall. It's only moving 1.6 meters per second of air, and there were fans that were running at 100% pushing or noise normalized that were outperforming it just hands down. So it's not really a high performance fan. You'd appear to be buying it just because it's got RGB. At this time, I also want to talk about a few other things. I have a whole new set of videos that I'm in the process of actually just doing the testing for right now. And I'm redoing my entire noise analysis spectrum. Previously, like I mentioned earlier, I had the microphone placed right up against the fans, and I was getting harmonics. I felt, or at least I feel like I was getting harmonics of either air rushing past the fan, causing extra frequency in it, or the blades running so close by the fan or the microphone that it was causing vibrations that way. It could be both, it could be one, it could be the other. But either way, I think it was skewing results. So I've gone back, revamped every single fan I've tested, which is why it's taking a long time and wasn't ready for this video. But I'm moving the microphone further away. This has a couple end effects. One is I'm not in a noise isolated chamber. I'm just in my office. So I have to wait till my house is quiet enough for me to do testing. I need to keep the room within 2 decibels of a standardized value. So that is a real challenge. Before, putting the microphone right up against the fan, the moment I turn on the fan, well, that's the only noise it's going to pick up. Number 2, well, I'm going to compare the fans against, I'm going to compare my original results against the new results so that you all know kind of what I did wrong or differently versus what I'm doing, what it's going to do now. And going forward, I'm using the new methodology, and I'm hoping that that'll be accurate within plus or minus 2 decibels as opposed to 4 decibels. And it should be noted that every 10 decibels in noise difference is a doubling in the noise volume. So that's a pretty significant change going forward. Other things for talking head is I want to acquire better testing equipment. It's through viewers like you hitting subscribe and joining me on Patreon to help support this channel that'll make all of that possible. I want to get a better microphone for doing testing, but it's up to you to decide if I'm worth it. Anyways, let's get back to the data and the graphs. So, AirCooler performance versus decibels. How does it rank against other fans? Well, it's at the bottom of the pack. It's not the worst. The P12 from Arctic is actually doing worse than it. And the NF-F12 3000 IPC is actually my #1 worst fan in this type of category. But the IQ SP120 is definitely not a great fan in noise performance. Okay, next up we have CFM testing. So personally, I don't really like CFM testing because it's basically a scientific test. It's very good at getting like PQ curves and kind of general performance data for how good a fan is in pressure type applications, but I don't think it's that good of a test when you're looking at case airflow. And the reason for that is to do a CFM test, you hook up the fan to a tube and you blow the air down the tube. So the tube helps free focus the air down it. If the fan has a tendency, like the SP120, to blow air off to the sides, it hides the fact that it does that because the air is always directed down the tube. Now, in some cases, you will see a performance difference, a very slight performance difference, between the fans that shoot it off to the sides versus ones that blow it down, because even though it's shooting off to the sides and it's concentrated down a tube, the air is still going off to the side, so it's not being directed as well forward as other fans. So it's just something to keep in mind with the test. What CFM testing is good at is kind of looking at it like it went through a radiator, or AIO, or heatsink, because those devices have a tendency to straighten out the air from the fan as it travels through it. Because, well, it's traveling through fins, and those fins are straightening out the air. So now that I've gone through all of that explanation, how does the SP120 do? Well, interestingly enough, in RPM versus CFM, it's outperforming my control, something it wasn't doing before. Except in the heatsink test. As for noise versus CFM, it's underperforming yet again. So it's very similar results to the heatsink test overall. And how does it compare against every other fan I've tested? Or maybe not every, but a majority of fans. Well, it is performing towards the bottom. It's not a truly terrible result, but it's not great. It's towards the bottom. And 100% PWM, well, we have the RPM, and we have the noise level. The airspeed is at the end of each of the dials. And it's not good. It's towards the bottom. For its RPM, it's doing just fine. For its noise level, it's okay. But overall, it's not that good. And we're on to the last graph. And this is CFM versus decibels. And it's right there. It's at the bottom end of what I consider the grouping of good fans. While the better fans are up here, or best fans are up there. Then you have the better fans, then you have the good fans, and then you have the fans. So it's on the better end of the good fans, or worse end of the good fans. So let's do our open box experience and take a closer look at the fan and think about and see if we can determine why it's performing the way it is. All right, let's do our open box experience. So Corsair's fan comes in this box, and it only works with IQ software. We're going to get into that in a second. The back of the box has some basic spec information and other information about the fan. This is what the inside looks like. It comes with some screws, some information, and that kind of stuff. Now, normally I would do an RGB section. However, Corsair's fan uses a proprietary RGB connector. And I don't have the hub, So I can't test the RGB on this flippin' fan. So we're going to just take a look at the box. This is what the RGB would look like on the fan. Based on the coloring on the box, it would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 6 RGB lights. Maximum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 maybe, but I think it's 6, which is less than average. And for the price of this fan, I think that we'll find in the value section that it's just not worth it. So I already don't recommend fans that use any sort of proprietary connector like we talked about with the thermal take quad fan. So already Corsair, you're off to a really bad start. You should not be putting custom connectors on fans. Period. End of story. Okay, let's move on and talk about the blade analysis and kind of where we got the performance about this fan from. So going over how it performed overall, just in a quick synopsis, in case airflow, it performed fairly poorly. In heatsink tested, it had good performance versus RPM, but its noise performance was pretty terrible. And a lot of that, I think, is going to come down to its blade shape. These blades are very pressure optimized. Now, the gap is a little bit on the large side, but they're very flat with not that steep of an angle in the back. So they're good at generating downforce for pressure, but not so good at generating airflow. So they should have performed fairly well in a radiator or a very restricted heatsink, but unless you're convinced on using, if you have a Corsair case and it comes with a hub, you're all set. If you're having to buy a hub and that kind of thing, I'm already saying ignore this fan altogether and get something else. In terms of its frame design, these little joggles around the edges, well, that's all area air can escape around the fan. So it's not as well pressure sealed as so many other fans are nowadays. So it's already losing performance that it could otherwise have. So if you had several of these fans together, you're going to have these fairly large gaps between the fans that air can escape around, thus reducing its total pressure capability, which is what you need in a radiator. So Corsair, you're making some very dumb mistakes in this fan. Next, there are no rubber vibration pads on this fan. I just think that this is an error. You want to reduce vibrations going from the fan into the case at all costs. The fan does have, the struts in it are very thin, but there's several of them and they help guide the flow. But considering its very poor case airflow performance, I would say that they're effectively ineffective. And they should have instead had better fan blades than use this extra thickness used in these struts. They should have had better blades than better struts, or made it a thicker fan. I'm sorry if you haven't noticed. I'm a little bit frustrated by this fan. I was hoping to plug in the RGB lights. Anyways, as I mentioned, the blade designs are very, very, very basic, but they're definitely a pressure optimized type blade. They're fairly unremarkable. They are definitely got a steep curve at the beginning, and then they sort of flatten out at the end. They have a very minor curve shape to them, but they are basically curved there, and then it becomes, they're basically flat on the inside with no curvature and curved on the outside. Just the fan blades themselves are fairly unremarkable. Let's just jump to the next section and talk value proposition. Okay, the last major section is the value proposition. This is a $24 fan, which puts it right at the top end of what I consider the value category, or the bottom end of what I consider the premium fan category. And first up is airflow through the case at 6 inches. And it is pretty bad. It is right at the bottom of all these fans with the likes of the NFF12, the T30. It is just vastly underperforming everything. As a matter of fact, at 100% PWM, it is way, 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 way too low. So we're going to just move on. How about at 100 or 11 inch mark? Well, at the 11-inch mark, its results are so bad that it's literally off the chart. This is the SP120, right there, at the top. It's 0. It's got 0 airspeed. It is by far the worst results ever done in any of my graphs. So don't buy it as a case fan. Moving on to CPU cooler performance per dollar. And since we're out of the areas where this fan does particularly poorly, how should you use these graphs? Well, if you're on an ultra tight budget, you want to stick to these graphs 100% and you want to get the absolute best bang for your buck. If you're got a little bit of extra spending money and you want RGB, like the SP120, or you want better noise performance, then you'd use this data with the other graphs to determine which fan has the best performance characteristics that suit your particular needs. And if you've got unlimited budget, you buy basically whatever you want. Now that all of that is said, how does it perform? Well, it's still kind of towards the bottom at noise normalized performance per dollar. At 100%, it hasn't really improved that. Actually, it's still right at the bottom. So it's fine, I guess, but it's not great in the value proposition. It's just so far away from so many better fans like the TLG12, the Antec Storm series, just are so much better value. But if you want RGB, I need to put together a video with RGB fans doing this kind of thing against each other. And last but not least is CFM, and it's kind of the same story as the CPU cooler. Well, now that we've finished the main part of the video, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching my video. If you've got constructive criticism for me on ways I can improve my videos so that you'll watch more of it, please leave it in the comment sections down below, because I really do spend time to read it and try to think about ways to improve my my presenting skills. And with that, are there any fans that you want me to check out? Any particular fans? Do you have an old fan that you'd like me to check out? Well, we can figure out a way to have you mail it to me. Unfortunately, I don't have much budget because everything is my own pocket money right now. But I am serious about, if you have a particular fan that you want me to take a look at, do leave it down below. I'll see if I can get my hands on one and add it to one of my videos. Other than that, thank you for watching. Have a good one. As promised, here's the raw data for the Corsair iQOO SP120. If you want to use this data for your own purposes, meaning you create your own private Excel chart and well, use it for generating your graphs or whatever data collection, you're welcome to do that. However, I do ask if you use it in any sort of publication, whether written, media, journal, or video, I do ask that you reference me and my channel because I'm the one who generated the data. Just generating the data for this level of detail is about 2 hours worth of work. And then there's updating the graphs, the charts, creating a PowerPoint presentation, writing a script, and filming, and then my very, very, very basic editing skills. That is another several hours of work. So it's doing the data collection I actually love, but doing everything else is a labor of love, just figuring out YouTube. So I appreciate it if you reference me, and other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on Computer Tech and More.